One thing I really appreciated during Triad Wars was every time there was a hint that something had been missed or something had gone wrong, Stuff would spend the time going back, looking at the position, recreating it in paint if he didn't have another visual of it accessible, and just figuring out what should have happened, where he went wrong, or where the other person could have found something, or where where something could have been found that wasn't. And I really appreciate this kind of intellectual curiosity, and I would repeatedly meet it with I cannot confirm or deny. But what would happen very reliably is he'd spend a little time on it, and he'd have something he thought, and then he'd refute his thought, right? He'd go, I think this is it, but he'd make sure, realize it was wrong, and then get to the correct solution. And just reliably coming out, he would have found the key move and key variation, and he was really curious about finding that throughout the tournament. And this is something I really respect in people and sometimes respect in myself, but not recently because I'm lazy about solver use. But I think is a really nice trait and sort of inspired me to make this video where I wanted to go back and look at a few things now that I've run the game more in depth through some solvers and see little bits we can learn from these games. I think there's a lot to learn here. One thing I want to note, and this is certainly not how Stuff thinks of himself, and it's just one tournament, it may not be that indicative, but Stuff is already in a version that doesn't include a prior. It just includes games from the rebirth of TTA and doesn't include any ratings from before that. Stuff is now has passed Delial for the best player at saving lost positions. Um, and I think the way he did so in the games he was in trouble was he reliably found moves. And I talked about this a lot, but he found moves that conceded something but made sure he got something in return in a way I really liked and enjoyed watching and thought was worthy of study, right? Because there's two ways to or two standard kind of ways to defend these difficult positions. One is what I would call the vid way, which is create absolute chaos on board such that your opponent, has to enter the dark forest and try to find their way out, and sometimes they cannot do so. And the way Stuff did it, which is a way that I connect a lot more to, is much more what I think what appeals to me, though I don't think I execute it so well, is instead of giving up on moves that at first glance are not appealing, realizing nothing's going to appeal, what's the thing I can do that gets me the most here? And finding ways to grab stuff not on the level of setting up maximal combos, but saying, okay, if you do what you want to do here, I get obvious compensation, right? Finding ways to justify tricky positions. I think he did really well, and I thought was worth looking at. It's not what we're going to look at today, though. The other thing I wanted to talk about at the start of this video was I think sometimes when you look at games, you're like, wow, that was an incredible move. I would have never seen that move, or I would not have considered that move. And sometimes you look at games and you're like, oh, they just made all normal moves and they eventually won. That's not so impressive. And I think in some sense it obviously isn't as impressive. But in another sense, most of being better at Triple Triad is the best players generally look at similar moves. Like there are clear differences, right? Seto obviously considers moves that I obviously do not consider. Um, I think one interesting thing about Delial and I is if there's a move I think needs to be considered, Delial almost certainly considered it, but he always considered more moves, right? If I think there are three critical moves in a position, Deli might think there are five critical moves. And Deli will have considered the three I considered, but he'll also have considered another two as being really important. Not in every position. This is just a general kind of in many positions. Um, we're gonna have considered the same moves. We may end up on the same move. We're going to have evaluated those moves somewhat similarly, but he is going to have thrown a wider net, right? So part of what impresses us is players that have a wider candidate net, right? Candidate moves. And Dully is a player who's obviously very impressive in this regard, and deservedly so. Um, Another thing, though, is just differentiating between those moves well, right? If there are three moves that initially appeal in similar regard, being able to consistently identify which of them is actually best, which is the hardest for the opponent to meet, is a really huge skill. And I don't know if I've already released it or I'm gonna release it soon, but an interview with Turds where he talks about each of the games. And one thing he notes sort of later in the match is he thinks it was a pretty safely played match. His match against Delhi was really chaotic, and as games against Delhi always seem to do, required a lot of creativity. These games were by no means worse, but they were playing moves more within conventional boundaries. And I think one thing really impressive about Turds' tournament win is he did well in both forms of games. And I don't think one's like the greater or the lesser. I remember stuff will make fun of me for doing this because I always tell not so relevant quick stories, and sometimes not so quick. But I remember Slash had just beaten Yojimbo in some tournament. I think it was SE Sid, but if you check the bracket and Slash didn't play Yojimbo, then it was a different tournament. Something around that time. This is going to be like 2009. So Yojimbo has started to get very good, and Slash beat him, and I thought it was a surprising win at the time. Slash went on to beat me later that tournament, which I also found a surprising win, but was a lot more disappointed about. And I asked him what he did, like expecting, like, at this point to beat Yojimbo, you have to have done something special. And Slash was like, well, I played a big corner, and then I defended it, and then I was winning. Um, which is to say, he did conventional defensive things, but he did them really well. I never saw the game, but I'm sure he made like really good choices on how precisely to do it. And yeah, I think you can see a game and be like, well, there was nothing that impressive here, but actually, there were lots of options. Just because you see the moves that are played, you don't see all the other moves that could have been played that they correctly chose these lines over, or maybe were incorrect, but like probably made correct decisions about. And I think often those choices of like, here's four moves that all look, maybe they all look similarly good, maybe they all look similarly bad, but picking the best one of them is a huge skill, and one that can mean you can look at games and it can be hard to differentiate the quality of them because they all look like normal moves. But one tell is like if someone makes all normal moves and beats Yojimbo versus if someone makes all normal moves and beats, insert almost anyone else, the former game is much more impressive, right? The former game is very likely to be optimized in really clever, subtle ways uh, that the latter game may not have to have been. So I think there's there's a real skill to choosing between candidate moves. What I want to do today is look at. I ran these through my best bot, which is not solver connected. It's just on positional concerns, and looked for places where it said improvements. I skipped two of the games because in two of the games I input the cards wrong, and I have to re-input those, and I haven't done so yet. But I wanted to look at because one thing that I've said a lot in the past, if you get in trouble a few times in a series, you're almost certainly going to lose. Like by the third time you're in trouble, odds are you've lost, right? It's just very hard to defend difficult positions over and over and over. And Stuff actually survived more really difficult positions than that. But Stuff also kept getting in difficult positions. And I think one thing I'm often drawn to when I get in difficult positions, especially in tournament games, games with hands, because games with randoms, you're often just like dead or so close to dead from the start that like there was a very narrow path to survival. And if you find it, wonderful. And if you don't find it, okay, it's really hard to find. With hands, you can definitely be behind in hands. And like we all agree, and my stats agree, and I said commentating, and they both agreed when playing. Turds had a hand advantage over Stuff throughout this match. This was a difficult match for Stuff to play because it's actually quite hard to build a hand around Larsa, and it seemed weird to switch off the Una pair because that's kind of the best A9 pair that doesn't interfere with Larsa, isn't redundant on what direction the A is like a really good A9 6-4 pair, and it just lined up badly against the A9 7-3s. They have all the incidental combos, but it made it really hard to switch off of because it is kind of optimized for going with Larsa. He has said, and I would be interested too if anyone has ideas of how to build around Larsa. I wonder if it was possible to just play like an a9 opposite, and then like Larsa opposite, some other a9 6-2 or 5-5, say a 5-5 a9, say Zidane, and then the fourth card is a utility. I wonder if that hand would have played any better, but you still have a problem that the Yunas line up badly. Just difficult, hard to figure out what he should have switched hands to. I didn't have good suggestions to over the match. I kept saying, I think you got to switch hands, but I didn't have ideas what to do with that. And he thought similar things and just didn't know what to switch to. But the other thing is, even with a hand disadvantage, your hand in this is just never going to be as behind as you can be in some brutal randoms, because like you're going to have consistent power in each direction, you're going to have powerful cards. It just can't be quite as bad. It can be quite bad, but not like, oh, I'm dead immediately. Instead, I think it's in this range of, oh, if I don't find the right plan immediately, I might be dead, rather than I am dead no matter what plan I find. And so something I find in tournament games, and something I think the solver bears out, is there are often a bunch of moves that tie, but a lot of them are so hard to distinguish from moves that lose. And like there are such similar moves that tie and lose that if you're finding moves in this range, you might find the one that ends up being a tie rather than a loss, but you're not going to have to calculate it far enough to know for sure, and it's just really dangerous. And one thing that feels really good and comfortable, and I think Delhi did a really good job against me in the TTAC match. I ended up beating him, but I beat him entirely in closed. But I just like was throwing counter hand after counter hand, and he wasn't switching, and my hands were setting up what I thought were all kinds of difficult things for him. And he would just immediately not immediately, he'd take the 7 minutes, but his move two of like every game of that series, and I've talked about that series before, I think that's another really educational series. His move two was so good in just tons of different ways, sometimes opposite corners, sometimes playing next to, this big variety of moves that just deflated whatever it was I did, where I was better, I was still like trying to push for a win, but it was just so clear he was going to have ties. He found ways to make the tying path straightforward rather than, and it was still like narrow paths, like he still had to find like, one of only a few moves that would hold the tie, but it was always a pretty straightforward move because he found the really precise move early that meant he didn't have to be as precise later. And so one thing looking at this series I just wanted to think and talk about was, were there ways where we could have ended up with less precision needed later, or less like brilliantly finding ways to defend? And the first position I put in was this one from game one, and the solver came out with a move that I briefly considered, because I think this is a move almost anyone briefly considers, but I dismissed really quickly as just not doing enough. And it spit this out, my professor bought, as the clear best move in the position. And I think it's a really interesting move. So I wanted to talk about why anyone would consider it, why I at least dismissed it, and why I think I was wrong to do so. Now, I haven't actually done any looking at, like, how dangerous actually is it. It may turn out to not be a very good move. But that's what I want to look at today, is moves like this from this series. So, Stuff's hand has taken a risk. It doesn't have an A down. And so it is, he said this, it is gambling that turds will happen not to have exactly a 9A corner for 7 with the 9 up and the A to the right, and turds happen to have exactly that corner. You'll notice, oh no, I put the hands in wrong. Oh no. All right, let's put the hands in right. Sorry about that. Yeah, why did I put like Larsa in Turds' hand? Okay, sorry about that. We have, per usual, my video making is just appallingly bad. Hopefully I won't make this mistake again. So now we have to put in the cards. This will take a sec to load. But Turds ends up getting a safe starter in 7, and it turns out that Stuff does not have any way to set up against it in 5. So we're left with this interesting and difficult decision. What do we do to meet this corner that we cannot take and we cannot set up against? How can we play such that we're not in trouble? And this is one of those positions where there are a lot of moves that aren't losing, but most of them lead to quite difficult paths, right? And turrets ended up at one point, though again, stuff has been magnificent at saving these positions, getting a winning position where Seto saw the win, but I don't think anyone else did or was going to. I would not have won this game from Turds' perspective, for example. Like, I think stuff defended really well. But there's the question of, like, how do you meet a move like this? And there can be a case for going next to it. This was something Dully did good at, deflating one of my safe corners that I played against him out of a counter hand. Here, it seems like Turds has a lot of power facing towards that. Doesn't seem like there's a great way to do it. There's setups from 5, but there's no setup here. There's sort of Akiyama setups where you set up one way and have a good punish on the other way. But the problem is, to do that, you kind of need a card that's good for either 9 or 1. For instance, like, say you set up a threat in 5, just picking an arbitrary, or set up a threat one way. This sets up a threat in 8. If they block 8, because you didn't set up 4, you kind of need to be able to play something safe in 9. And here, you did not have a way to do so. Something that, like, grabs the card in 8, but very much not appealing options to do so here. So the Akiyama 5, where you set up one way, but if they block that way, you have counterplay, really didn't exist here. Some people like to play far sides. Those never really appealed to me. I kind of like playing in the far corner. My first instinct, I mean, I'm not much of a far corner player generally, but my instinct here against something like this is, you have played a strong corner facing this, you now have less power facing that direction, and I believe I expected stuff to play here when watching this game. Stuff ended up playing here, which is not a losing move, totally reasonable move. But this Professor Bot put out a different move that I think was really, really interesting, and I was looking for stronger corners than this, because I was thinking in terms of kind of, they have put out something difficult, we need to put out some challenge for them as well. But I think this is a really interesting suggestion. The obvious is it sets up a same in 4. But there's no threat in 8, so they can just block 4. And that's basically where I stopped thinking. But we can think a little further here. One is, the threat in 4 is a pretty serious threat, because while Turds can recapture in 8, if you imagine, say, Turds play something elsewhere, and you get something like this, while Turds, actually, let's do it differently than that, because that won't show what I'm trying to show very well. So let's, I don't know, this is not a particularly good move, but let's say you get something like this. Stuff may have options to play in 9, because you don't have 5. Now, maybe he never has the card to do so, but it's really important that Turds doesn't have 5 here when he ever recaptures from 8. And another thing I like about this move is, if Turds decides to block 4, stuff potentially always just has, like, something like this in 5, sets up a threat in 8, there's the same wall in 2. Looks fairly promising. I bet this is a tie, but nope, this loses multiple ways. All right, that's a bad idea. But so let's scratch that one. But ideas like that, my point is now weakened by the fact that I suggested a completely losing move. Again, I have not looked at this in advance. I don't really know what I'm talking about. I just saw the thing spit out this move, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I thought about it in my head. Now, yeah, one thing I didn't notice is this is a plus. Yeah, Vanille is set up everywhere. Okay, that makes sense. That's a terrible move. But my point is, you cannot play in 4 such that I can't take from 5. Because sometimes we think in terms of the power used up, right? 9A37 has used power up right, so it makes sense to play something in the top right where Turds now has less power facing, right? Turds no longer is a capture in 2, that kind of thing. But it can also make sense to play in such a way that to take the valuable square, if Turds had to block 8, and this is what happened in the game, not that way, Turds can block 8 with an A facing up, and that's going to be safe and hard to set up against here. But if Turds has to block 4, he can't block 4 safely, So even if stuff can't play in 5 now, maybe he can wait a turn on playing in 5, but have threats there later and find his tie. Now, I'm not sure there's a great way to do this. So my current guess is this is probably a move that ties. Let's see if I'm a moron again. Yeah, this one ties. And there's probably a bunch of other ties. Let's see how many ties there are. There are 2 ties. Okay, 9 is unlikely. Yeah, and 2 is not, you have to be careful about which card to put in 2. So this is not necessarily leading to a trivial tie. Any position where you put in a move and you only have 2 ties and one of them is, something ludicrous like this, probably not the easiest position to save in practice, but this is a fairly normal move to make here. But yeah, this is a more dangerous position than it could have been. But I thought it was this interesting idea of it's not that you're playing an adjacent corner against the strong side, which I often advocate, because the corner has 2 strong sides. And you're not playing a card that is any challenge for the opponent. The opponent can take this card easily. But you are playing a card. This is sort of the Akiyama corner of adjacent corners, the Akiyama center play, where the Akiyama center play says I only need 1 square, but I have to have counterplay if you take that square. This says I am setting up 4, and often setting up 1 square is not very good because they can just block that square. However, here it says I am setting up 1 square, and if you block it, you cannot do so with high numbers facing out, and I should have tools after that. Now, as is, this only gives 2 ties. If we look at like the game continuation, for example, Stuff's move, the path, he had 8 ties, right? Now these are fairly tricky. Like a lot of the moves are in 2 or 3, which is like this is I think all hard stuff to find, and 5 is tricky as well. I'm not saying this leads to easy ties. The position's dangerous, but I don't actually think the computer's suggestion here of 964A and 1 is a clearly easier path or anything. But I thought it was this interesting concept of rather than saying you have used your power to the right, so I will make the game rightward, it's you have used your power to the right, so I will play such that you'd really like to have power being able to stick out safely towards the right. I thought that was a neat idea. So, I thought that was interesting. I think my most appealing option is still this, which uses the directional power the other way. But I'm not sure that's any better. It's just not obvious what lines to start checking because Turds has lots of moves he could make here. He can block, 4 or 8, and both are kind of dangerous because, again, we don't really have safety in 3 or 9 in response, and we don't have captures in 4 or 8. And so those positions are going to be difficult. I guess 4 is probably best, just off the top of my head. But yeah, I don't know. Okay, so I think 964A and 1, an interesting idea, but not clearly getting any easier path to a tie, more interesting conceptually than actually an improvement. All right, let's see what it wants in the next game. So in this game, Turds started, this is game 3, with 3, 7, 9, A, and 9. And Stuff ended up playing A9, 1, 8, and 7. And in this position, it turned out this was a tie, though it was quite a dangerous path at first glance. But with some calculation, you soon realize, yeah, he has this under control. But it is rather scary to go into. But my question again was there anything that could have been done different on move 2? And the professor bot liked a few options more, so we'll take a peek at each. One was it liked Yuna in 3. Now, Yuna in 3 is a bit of a strange move to me, because again, you're making an adjacent corner against the weak side. Right? Last time there were 2 strong sides. I tend to advocate adjacent corners against the strong side, which is what Stuff played, though without setting anything up. This is an adjacent corner against the weak side, and so it seems to me very possible for Turds to block 6. But again, we will notice what this bot likes is if you have used your A up in a direction, I will play an adjacent corner. It will play an adjacent corner such that you do not have safety in the in-between square. So if we look at some straightforward move like 9, 5, 5, 9, and 6, Stuff has a threat at some point. Probably not now. It looks like it gets comboed to hell. Though there are combos back. There's like we can imagine a game that has just a really long combo chain here. Um, Looks like we're not happy at the end of it, but, there's some complexity there. And if there's that much combo, there's presumably sidelines. Like, again, we probably don't want to take it immediately, but it's important we have some threat there. Now, if this doesn't tie, I would think this is a pretty bad line, because this is the obvious follow-up, but this does tie. Um, so, yeah, interesting L. I guess you have anything in one covered, and if turds plays something like 5, I guess. Hmm. This doesn't look trivially like a tie to me. I'm sure there's some straightforward move. Let's have it. Okay, yeah. I was gonna say this looks tricky. I guess you're using the fact that you have the same wall in one. So like if they go something like here, you're playing you're playing Larsa in one to get the tie. Okay, but this is hard to see at distance. Again, this is an idea that it does tie, but it seems to me quite difficult to show. How many ties are there here? Just the 1 in 7. So this is really a pain to see at distance because this is a very strange. I mean, like you can justify it with straightforward calculation, but like it's not a setup move in 7 or anything like that. This is obviously not a trivial move to find, especially at distance when playing in 2. So again, I would suggest this is a clearly worse move than played in the game. Well, last one I think maybe only a little worse, but an interesting idea that this bot is repeatedly showing of maybe you have a way to attack when they use up their highest number in a direction, playing in an adjacent corner, not facing that high number, but making it so if they want to take the in between square, they are missing that high number. Interesting concept. We're not like in these examples, I'm not seeing clear evidence it's a great idea, but it makes sense conceptually. And so these might just be instances where it's not shining as much as it could. Might be a nice tool to have in your toolbox if you don't already. I certainly don't. I'm sure someone out there does. But an interesting concept. Again, I don't think this is any improvement, but I do think it's an interesting concept. Now, it also quite liked some stranger moves. It liked this quite a bit, which looks a wee bit strange to me. My question is, say they just take safety. How many ties do you have? Quite a few. And they're in 2? Not the square I would have guessed. And also something like this. How many ties do you have? 4. But 3, yeah. These look like moves you find. So actually, which card's in 3? Yeah, 5, 5, 9, 9, and 3 is not a particularly hard move to find. So yeah, maybe that move's better than I give it credit for. And it also quite liked Yuna in 2 and Yuna in 4. And I hate far sides. I'm not going to spend a lot of time worrying about these. But if you do want to investigate, and again, I think this is a match very worthy of study. Probably, I mean, it was the longest finals of the return, and probably the most interesting finals of the return. So if you're looking for, a finals match to study, this is probably the one. And those might be interesting moves to figure out why they might work and maybe why they don't. But they don't lose. They're all fine on that front. But I think the interesting move from this game is this, and the interesting idea this bot is showing is adjacent corners trying to take advantage of the missing number rather than trying to set up on stuff. And again, all its suggestions are non-losing, but that doesn't mean they're improvements because what stuff played is non-losing. But it was kind of dangerous, though. I think after he gets his move in 8, he's clearly pretty safe, and I didn't think there was any chance he was going to lose this game after that. But it's a dangerous kind of position to go into because you have very little to attack, and Turds has quite a bit to attack. So I would be worried going into this, but I think nicely handled again by Stuff. All right. The one other thing I wanted to mention this game was turrets started in 9, and this will take a little while to run, but the bot doesn't think this is very dangerous. Or the solver. We're on to solver. Solver doesn't think this is very dangerous. I think it's more dangerous than the solver does, right? I think there's not like clear path to getting out of danger. So there are a few moves that lose immediately, but there's a lot of moves where you're going to be under substantial pressure. Now, what the Professor bot wanted turrets to do is just go in 5 with this card, and it doesn't suggest 5 starters very much, so I just wanted to check if this looked any different. But no, it looks, similar number of losses against. There may be hidden pressure here, but okay. I don't think there's reason to think this is a particularly great move without extensive analysis. So we'll move on to the next one. We're just looking for ideas. So we're on to game 4, and Stuff played in 1. And this time we'll be looking at Turds' responses. Now, I believe I wanted him to maybe go... No, that was in a later game. I have no idea what I wanted on this one. Turds ended up playing 3-7, 9A, and 9, and I think they played a pretty balanced game. I thought Stuff should have the advantage here, but it turns out Turds' cards fit together very nicely, and actually Stuff had to be a little bit careful here finding a move in 2. But I think this was a very safe game on both sides. Like, I don't think there was too much risk of either player losing this game. And I think Stuff is a little unlucky he didn't get more advantage because, again, I don't think highly of this 1-4-6-9 structure, but I may be wrong on that. But I think Stuff is just a little unlucky with how the cards clicked that he didn't get a bigger advantage here. That said, what did the bot think Stuff could have tried here? So the bot liked going for the setup in 5. Sure. This was definitely a move, I think, on everyone's radar, but not one I'm too interested in looking at. It also liked 9A 3-7 in 3. And this isn't quite the same thing, right? Because Turds' hand doesn't have power facing up. But I do think in general, so I do think this is a different move type. In fact, a better version, this might have been what I was advocating for in the game. I like 3, 9, and 8 and 3 more because Turds is the only one that has the plus in 2, and he has good captures in 4 or 6. And I think this can be a nice way of pressuring a corner that you already have one way. Is, you set up against the other way. And both these moves, this is back to the very standard, like the type of move I like. I prefer 3, 9, 9, 8. But the type of adjacent corner where you set up against the sides you can't currently take. You have a good capture in 4, so you set up in 2. Because you have a good capture in 4, it's hard for them to block 2. To me, this looks promising and a little more appealing than what was played. Now, just for our laziness, we'll check which gives the opponent fewer ties. But I'm gonna prefer the adjacent corner regardless of what it says. But it says Stuff only has 8 ties here. Now, again, after Stuff plays here, I think Stuff is doing quite well. But okay, and against this move, it thinks Stuff has 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 ties. Yeah, suck it, Turds. Clearly a better move. 7 is fewer than 8. Yeah, so that's obviously no real difference. But moves with the same number of ties can obviously be much better or weaker moves, right? If you play a move where they have 1 tie, but it's like, take the recapture, that's a lot easier to find than 1 tie where it's like, go really distant from everything and don't even set anything up, right? 1 is pretty straightforward to find, 1 is really hard to find. So my guess is this move would have been a little more dangerous, but most of the bot suggestions have been adjacent corners that I've found interesting, and I did find the other form more interesting, but this standard move seems to me a stronger move, and the first time it's actually found an arguable improvement, because I don't think it improved on Stuff's play in either of the previous 2 games we've looked at. But I think this might be a slight improvement on Turds' play here. This is not to say Stuff played better in the match than Turds. I think Turds played phenomenally. It is to say This bot suggested improvements for stuff were, I think, a really interesting concept, but not actually very good. But not bad. Like just maybe a little worse, but kind of like this is tough. And this suggestion seems pretty strong to me. All right, on to game 5. So Turds at this point was pretty committed to this 3-7, 9A, and 9, and Stuff met it in 1, and the bot played a move he obviously considered, and in fact played on his next move, Larsa in 7. I do think again this is an improvement, but it was obviously on Stuff's radar and is not. He played it in a previous game. He played it later this game. Uh, I think it's almost certainly he was deciding between Yuna in 1 and Larsa in 7. And while I do think Larsa in 7 probably a little better here, this is no breaking news or here's a move that shows some interesting differing idea. Just a reasonable move to make. And we move on to game 7 because I misinput game 6. And now this game is the game Turds won and Turds won it with an adjacent corner. So it's kind of funny that this one, the bot finally moves away from adjacent corners and just wants him to play the far corner. Because Lock was such a difficult card for Stuff to play against. But I can see why you wouldn't want to do this, and I think I prefer just what Turds did, because this gives up the threat of a capture in 4, so it gives Stuff a kind of straightforward thing to do, block 2. And while you do have your safe card in 6, it does give the opponent a clear plan that I think there's a good chance is pretty decent. But this also is safe, and safety is pretty strong. I'm curious which gives more losses, which gives more ties. So this move, it looks like about half and half red, half blue. Just eyeballing it, maybe a little more red than blue. And this move, okay, that's clearly more red than blue, but we will also notice it gives up a threat in 2, and every move in 2 ties. So this is one of those situations where this move gives fewer ties, but the kind of obvious thing to do, everything there ties. This move gave more ties, but they seemed more varied between different squares, like you had to be specific rather than just find one core idea. You had to really figure out the line. That can be an indicator, right? If there's like 4 ties in one square and 4 ties in another square and no ties elsewhere, well, those squares are probably pretty obvious squares to play in, and you're probably going to find a tie. If there's like 1 to 2 tie, 1 tie in, say, all the squares, like every square has a tie, but it's a different card, that can be a position that's really dangerous because there's no like kind of core plan or path to go down. Every way of tying is specific and unique in its own way, and that can be a way that it's really difficult to find ties. So just the pure tie counts here is not super indicative of things, though is a useful quick mechanic to check. Okay, so hopefully some interesting discussion, and I thought I want to kind of call these the Akiyama side moves, except I've never seen Akiyama play them. But they remind me of what I think of as the Akiyama center play, which again, for posterity, is a move that sets you up, say, against a pretend like we couldn't take this starter, something like this, that sets you up in 4, but pretend we don't have 2. But the idea is, if they don't have a good way to block 4, pretend this could take and was safe. This would be a great response. They don't have a good way to block 4, so even though we only set up 1 square, we're going to get to use that 1 square. Either because when they go there, we can take it and lock it in, again, pretend Ayla flips, or because they won't go there, in which case it's fine that we don't have 2, because we have 4. We have a way to attack their starter whenever we want to. And this seems a sort of a similar concept we've seen in these games, of especially in the first few, so I don't really have an example here, but of Turds plays some kind of corner, and Stuff could have replied, and again, I think his moves were better than these, could have replied with an adjacent corner, not setting up against the strong side, but taking advantage of the fact that that A is out of Turds' hand. And so there's not a way to block the in-between square where Stuff won't have play against it, right? It guarantees you will have play against the in-between square when you set up your L. And I don't think that's a concept I've ever been all that familiar with. My instinct is very much when you go for the adjacent corner and you go for the L, you set up against the strong side. And this is showing a different concept. And even if when you see a different concept, if it conceptually makes sense, even if when you see it, you're like, this execution is not all that convincing, that doesn't mean the idea is bad broadly. It just means it didn't apply here, and maybe keep an eye out for it. I suspect it is, on average, a weaker way to do an adjacent corner, but the adjacent corners I like are not always available. Um, I'm not sure this is a perfect example, but if you find the game that Reye played against me in a weekly open, where I had a safe corner against him and he played an adjacent corner and immediately diffused everything and was just clearly pretty safe from that point on in a game where it looked like he was just dead from the randoms. I think he did something kind of similar. Though actually, I think I had high numbers facing down there, so maybe that's not a good example. And then he crushed me in the second game. Absolutely wiped the floor with me. Both games, really, because the first game, like, he wiped the floor with me to tie from a terrible random. And the second game, he wiped the floor with me to win. Very nice match from Reye there. Not super relevant here. I thought it might be a similar adjacent corner, but I don't think it was. But just another way to think about adjacent corners and general babble about gameplay. I guess the last thing I want to say is like there's so many ways to think about triple triad skills, but one way to break them down is like how many of the candidate moves do you see, right? Do you consider a wide net or a narrower net? And I think there are people who throw too wide a net and thus don't have enough time to check things as deeply as they should. And there are people, possibly me, very possibly me, who throw too narrow a net, who don't have enough ideas for alternative types of moves and don't find enough creative moves. Um, but there can be players weak in both directions. And just in general, like, are you identifying the moves you really need to consider? Again, I think in one sense, Deli and I are pretty similar. We'll generally be on the same standard moves, just Deli will throw a wider net for what is possible than I will. And that comes with advantages and disadvantages, but we have sort of the same core sense of these are the normal moves, and then Deli extends it. He has more concepts for moves, drawing him to other ideas. And then the second thing is how well do you do differentiating between those moves, right? How much do we dismiss the wrong moves and get ourselves to the right moves? And that's a lot of the skill, right? There's going to be a lot of moves that, or a fair few moves that jump out as potentially appealing, and being able to pick the right one out of them is just huge skill. Um, but what I like doing when I look through games like this and someone strong, either a strong player or this bot is very strong, like this is a very strong bot, suggests moves that are not instinctive for me, I try to think, what are the values here, right? What is it doing that I am not looking for? Is this something I should or could start looking for in my own games, to widen the number of moves I see? And especially in difficult positions, it is really so, in my opinion, when you are ahead, when you are doing well, sometimes there are creative wins, sometimes there aren't. But a lot of the time, being precise about the standard move you make is sufficient to play really well. And I think you are more often forced into valuable creativity when you are behind, and thus the normal moves aren't working. And I think that often can be, and actually, like, Stuff was great at this match, is the more creative moves are born of the normal moves I want to make aren't working. And that greater creativity can lead you to be making obscurer moves, or to figuring out a way to make the normal moves work anyway, even though it looks like they don't. That tends to be my preference, and that's what I think Stuff did really well. If you're looking for games in the other direction, I think that's something Vid does really well. What was my point? Oh, my point was, and to do that, when like the standard options aren't jumping out at you, when it's hard to grab a logical thread of anything because nothing's really working and the position's tough, what I think really helps is simply having more types of moves you naturally understand. Because then you can throw that wider net that hopefully gets you to an idea that actually makes some sense. So even though I'm not convinced at all by either of the two examples of this kind of adjacent corner here, I like having it somewhere in my head because I think this is a type of move where there's possibilities that could be good with it that I would not find. And maybe now there's a chance for me to find them. And if someone is more experienced with this type of move than me or wants to add some thoughts to these moves, I would love to hear it. I have just explained what jumps out at me as appealing. And I'm sure I missed some stuff because, again, I haven't done any messing about in these positions, except I mentioned something to turds and was thinking about it in my head for a little bit, just on the first example. All right, that'll end it. How long have I been talking? Too long. Man, this is the first real talk about triple triad video that's not just following a game video I've done in a while. Hopefully it was alright.